As you all know, the last 6 years have contained some really difficult years for farmers, and they've been really difficult to keep businesses profitable. Even considering the substantial returns from the northern wheat belt, the level of return on capital we're seeing in broadacre farming is mostly too low. It's been too low to allow for reasonable levels of debt reduction. It's been too low to allow for reinvestment back into farm businesses, and certainly through the central and the southern regions. And it's been too low to allow for investment of profits into creating new technologies or developing greater efficiencies. For example, where is the next trace elements going to come from? Or the equivalent of trace elements going to come from, or the next no-till. Hopefully it's this room, but it's got to be, we've got to be chasing that. We've got to have profits in the industry to drive that. This is a long-term issue. It's one that has multiple causes, and many of those are beyond our immediate control. In the meantime, as an industry, we're continuing to lose a lot of farmers, and many of those with a very high level of skill. So the Bridging the Yield Gap project, as Gerard just mentioned, is looking at some of the ways that we can improve the profitability of ordinary farmers, and with them, hopefully, the industry as a whole. I guess we're aiming to address a part of the issue, part of the structural issue that's there, but that's within our control, and really we're about trying to find solutions to increasing farm profit. So, what can you do to make your farming clients more profitable? We've already mentioned that the average return on capital is lower than we'd like it to be, and there's always exceptions. We've had the exceptional run of seasons in the northern wheat belt in the last probably 3 years now, but that's part of the normal cycle, and that's outside our control. So what we've looked at here is the individual farmers that are performing consistently well, and those that are generating profits that are well above the average. In doing this, we're looking at the medium to long-term financial performance data of our client base in the Bridging the Yield Gap region, so that's the medium and high rainfall zones. We've removed clients with significant distorting factors, so those that had pastoral interests or those sorts of things. We've set about identifying and selecting the most profitable of those businesses. And then we're establishing what the differences were those by meeting with each of them and discussing their systems and looking at their approach and trying to work out what they do differently compared to your average farmer. In other words, trying to learn what we can learn from these growers. The challenge, has been touched on a couple of times this morning, is trying to work out how much of this knowledge is actually transferable, or how much of it can be transferable with the help of the people in this room. So, only farms located in medium and high rainfall zones of WA were included. We selected 26 farmers from 200 that met the selection criteria, so good long-term data sets, reliable data, that sort of thing. The clients were ranked using 3 measures, and we ranked them on data going back to about 2003. So the first was return on capital, and generally that seems to favour the lower rainfall zone, as you would imagine, lower land values. We ranked them on operating profit per hectare, which tends to favour the higher rainfalls because you've got higher production levels, obviously. And we ranked them on a measure that you may not be familiar with, which is operating profit per hectare per millimetre of rainfall, which has a tendency to favour more of the medium rainfall. So the reason for the 3 measures was to try and get a fair representation of growers across the regions. But the people in the selected group performed well pretty much in all 3, and certainly 2 of the 3. So, you've already heard some of the numbers, but the best farmers are achieving 174% of the average farmer's profit. Now, we're in an age when we're looking at 1 to 2% production gains for agronomy gains. And I'm not saying that all of this is achievable for everybody, but this is an enormous level of profit that we can actually improve for the average farmer. And as mentioned just a while ago, if you can get some of the guys who are below average to come close to this is an enormous improvement, and it should be a huge benefit to the industry. As you can see, that gain is year in, year out, it's every year. So let's think about what that means. So in this group, our survey average farm size was 3,139 hectares, and that equated to $226,000 more operating profit every year. Over the 6 years, this translated to an additional $1.76 million of equity growth. So in that, the best farmers actually grew by $2.8 million. The average farmer grew by about just over $1 million. So let's look at some of the basics about the businesses. They actually started with very similar sized businesses. The top farmers were 123 hectares larger at the start of the period. And by the end of the 6-year data period that we've extracted this data from, they were 390 hectares larger. So they're actually managing to expand and expand reasonably well. And I've included in here the average May to October rainfall. It was only 2 millimetres difference, average over the 6 years. So we should also note that the group that was selected, the best farmer group, were located pretty evenly across the regions, and they're pretty representative where our client base lies. So we don't think there's any, we don't think this variation in rainfall, there is any significant variation in rainfall. Just mentioning about our client base, we have more clients in the medium rainfall than the high rainfall. So there was certainly more of the top group actually came from the medium rainfall zones. The top farmers, when you look at the first of these two tables, appear to be spending more on fertiliser, fuel and chemical. But most of these variations are actually explained by the larger crop area. The top farmers are cropping about 73% of their farms compared to the average at about 61%. So this is starting to show the first of the real differences that we're seeing in these two groups. So, and importantly, when you work it out as a proportion, they also had less legumes, although legumes are still fairly significant. I don't mention canola there, but canola was seen as a very significant break crop, and the better growers were growing more canola, on average about 381 hectares compared to about 310. Where this becomes interesting is that the top farmers weren't only cropping a larger area over the long term, they also had the systems in place that enabled them to extract a higher yield. So more crop and a higher yield. They were getting about 22% higher yield on their wheat over the 6-year period, and we'll pick out the barley at about 19% higher. To maintain both is one of the key elements of the increased profitability. We should also note that with the increase in profitability of livestock, the dominance of this style of management might actually change over the next couple of years. So if we run this same analysis in another 2 or 3 years' time, we may see much more of the livestock domination coming into this, but we'll see. The top farmers have about a 19% larger investment in plant, but by the time you put that on a dollars per crop hectare basis, this is about 13% less. So in other words, you're getting a lot more efficient use out of their plant, even though they've got a few more dollars, nearly $200,000 more dollars invested in plant. In the interest of time, I haven't included a slide on livestock performance, but in essence, the top farmers ran a slightly smaller flock, but they were still outperforming on just about every measure, every economic measure that we've been using on them. And this is after considering that those in the top group, there's a lot in the top group that consider the sheep enterprise as a major part of their business, but there's also quite a few that considered it as a very minor part, and they didn't pay it any attention, and there were some pretty terrible sheep numbers amongst some of those guys, but they were over very, very small numbers of sheep. So the specialist sheep producers here were generating exceptional returns, largely through well-managed pastures and high stocking rates. So the key points from the data. Well, obviously some of the differences are too large to ignore. To be a member of the top group, what you see in front of you are the essential traits. Now, I've left passion in there because even though it's something of a motherhood statement, it's also, I see it as a drafting gate. If you didn't have passion, you weren't there. You didn't have a chance at all. The rest of them, the planning, the preparation, the commitment, the determination, the timeliness and getting the job done, were really key. And the other key part of these is not only having all of those, but not being willing to compromise on them either. They have a very integrated approach. Everything in these farms is about the systems. So every component has a strong fit with the next. For example, dry seeding, on all bar one of the top 25 growers, they were all planning on a very large area of dry seeding, with the group on average intending to sow about 35%. I'm not certain on the average numbers, but I think that's about 20% for average growers. We'll know a bit more about that this year. The systems in place for weed control, rotation and those sorts of things are designed around early seeding and high yields. Rotations were different across the group. There was a number of different styles of rotations really to suit the farms and the areas and the farmer's own thinking. But they all had rotations that worked very well for their business and their location. And for example, I'll pick one of them. It was in some of the higher rainfall areas where farmers had a phased rotation. So they're really aiming for long periods of pasture, long periods of crop. And the idea being in the pasture phase trying to get very high densities of pasture and therefore high stocking rates. So some of these guys, the comment that coming out of them was that they had trouble keeping the grasses in their pastures and they had the trouble keeping grasses out of their crop. And once it got to a point of being unmanageable in either of those phases, they'd switch to the next one. So 3 to 6 years pasture, 5 to 10 years of crop. The specialist stock producers under this situation are achieving about 1.5 times the district averages for stocking rates. It's quite enormous. One example is about 8.2 DSE was where we're taking the district stocking rate, and his was around 11.5 and maintaining that over a number of years. Yep. You must get seeding right, the simple stuff. Seeding depth, placement of fertilisers, testing of seed quality, and that'll be particularly an issue this year after the rainfall through harvest. We've seen a lot of focus on the right chemical rate or the best fertiliser, but probably not enough on the basics. And I think this is one of the areas that we can really improve on. These guys are only making small changes to their programs mid-season, but they seem to be more nimble in their approach, and they seem to be much better at managing their inputs to best effect. From my experience, when you get to the lower rainfall regions, the better farmers are prepared to make larger levels of changes to the seeding programs than what these guys are. So I think there's differences you'll find between the medium and the high and the low rainfall. So management lessons. Their approach to business is very rational. It's a profit focus. Everything revolves around management practices. In line with my earlier comments about their integrated approach, the impact of any decision is really well considered before being adopted. Not only as to whether it's profitable, but the impact on the other areas of their businesses. And while they're not late adopters of new ideas, they're rarely the first to be involved. But they're certainly watching and seeking information as soon as something new comes out. Planning and preparation is a key. They know their margins well. They do keep relatively set rotations, although not usually on paper past 1 year. And they actively move larger decisions outside periods of stress. And they rarely make losses. Let me spend a couple of seconds on that. In poor years, they either generate very small losses or no losses at all. They manage their businesses so they're not committed completely. They make acceptable margins in fair years, but they get to nearly obscenely good profits in the very good years. They just don't miss those. And with that, there's very few what you call management mistakes. And what I'm calling a management mistake is something you quantify. There's the decisions that every farmer makes with limited knowledge. They seem to get 90% of those 50-50 calls right when you check them with the benefit of hindsight. The management skill is great. From a human perspective, experience is a key. While most have been actively involved in the planning with their businesses from their late teens, and all have had a management role from their early to mid-20s and some from their late teens, this is one of the keys, another of the keys. They've had great experience in a controlling or at least a managing role in their businesses from a very young age. From a training and succession point of view, they seem to be able to keep someone in their business operating in their prime. Now, this point needs to be tested over a bit longer time because we've only looked at 6 years. Probably the question here is, are they in the top because the period that we've measured is when the people were in their prime, or is the succession in these businesses working really well as well? They seem to have relatively aggressive personal goals, and to my knowledge they're not mostly high-profile people. They tend to be very focused on their farms. Like most farmers, they work really hard. We're not yet established that this is vastly different to the average, but they're working 103 hours a week during the peak times, and they're working about 54 hours a week during the off-peak times. I'm not sure if this is an indication of the lack of availability of labour in agriculture, but certainly these guys are very dedicated to their business. We come back to that passion. They've got to have that passion about their industry to be doing that sort of time. Communication rates very highly with everybody in this group, and it was something that's really, really different about the businesses we're involved in this. They really value their communication. They're not afraid to pick up the phone and ask what some might think of being dumb questions, but they still ask them and to make sure they get it right. The other is about 69% of this group stated that they had a mentor, or a close friend or someone to go and bounce ideas off that's outside their professional group. So this is someone they go and check their thinking with before they actually jump into a decision. So that brings me to some of the equity and return on capital numbers and my final slide. The differences in the top group are too large to ignore. They started with a 5% smaller investment than the average, and they finished with substantially more. They're achieving compounded growth rates of about 7.7% per annum, compared to the average farmers that are producing about 3%. That does include a little bit of land value change. Now you've got to remember this is from the period, the numbers here from 2005 to 2010 inclusive, so they've had some very, very tough years in that period as well. When you look at the cash flow return on capital, that doesn't look that exciting at all actually. 1.3% for the average and 4.4% for the better farmers. Now I should point out here that this is using the Planfarm calculation for return on capital, which includes a wages and management figure that comes in at $50,000 plus 1% of capital. So as soon as you get into the high rainfall areas and with relatively high land values now, this figure is actually coming up as a very large number and larger than what most businesses are spending. When I compare it to some of the other measures that are used through the drought pilot type program, the drought pilot numbers on the same people over the same period of time are coming in about 1.5% to 3% higher depending on the style of the business. But they're still not great returns on capital. When you compare this to, say, 6% for a risk-free return on capital in the bank, it makes farming not look like a terribly exciting industry. But then if we maybe take some positives from that and say that, well, 7.7% for the better farmers is actually not a bad return through a very tough period of time. So clearly this has been a quick overview of the project outcomes, but there's a hell of a lot we can learn from this group. And there's a lot more detail in what you can pick up, what we will pick up out of this. So I guess what we're seeing here is a difference between the very good farmers and the profit-focused farmers. I don't think there's too many average farmers left out there when you look at the numbers of farmers that are left. Most of the people we deal with I'd regard as being quite good operators. But there seems to be a strong difference between those that are profit-oriented and those that are just there. We must also, before I conclude, acknowledge the contribution to the 26 families that we actually interviewed as part of the process. Without them, we would have had the numbers, we wouldn't have got anywhere near the level of confidence and the level of thought around why they do what they do, even though we're actively involved in those businesses from day to day. So with that, I'll leave you and I'll hand over to Peter to discuss how the Department of Ag and Food are planning to use some of the information that we've discussed through this analysis. Thank you.